Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello, welcome to this lecture on consumption. This is part 1 on the topic consumption as seen from a cultural studies perspective. You are with us in the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning, which is a joint venture by the Indian Institutes of Technology and the Indian Institute of Science. Our area of study is broadly cultural studies, and I am here to give you a series of lectures, about 40 lectures on various aspects, various issues, various concepts belonging to the domain cultural studies. We are now in lecture 8 module, in the third module in cultural studies. Well, as always, we will begin today's discussion with a brief recap on what we did in the last lecture. The last lecture was devoted to the topic globalization, and we began by saying that there are 3 positions, or we may say safely that there are 3 positions with regard to globalization. The first is hyperglobalization. As you will recall, hyperglobalization is an orientation towards globalization that sees globalization as an imperative, that sees globalization as inevitably spelling the doom of nation states. And the second orientation we saw is transformationalism, an attitude which holds that there is change all right, and nation states are quite irrevocably affected and changed, impacted by globalization, but it does not really hold like hyperglobalization, that there is the impending end of nation states. And the third attitude we saw was skepticism, which does not at all affirm that nation states are dwindling, and it holds that even though there are globalizing forces, the nation state is here to stay. Next, we saw that among all the processes that underlie globalization, we may say that the 3 major ones are economics, internationalism, and information. We then saw culture as an economic good. Culture in globalization, studied from a cultural studies perspective, sees culture as an economic good, sees cultural flows also in terms of, sometimes in terms of economic flows, though there are important differences in the 2 different domains. However, we may safely say that culture is also seen or explained in terms of being an economic good. Next, we saw that globalization entails a paradox. This paradox goes like this. Even as the world is compressed, even as the world today is sort of shrinking in terms of being a global village, in terms of easy accessibility. Nevertheless, there is also the other side, which is a widening, a widening through connections, particularly connections to electronic data. So, the paradox we saw in forming globalization is one of both compression and connection, of widening and of compressing. Next, we also looked at what the scholar Arjun Appadurai has called disjunctive flows. We may see or we may consider or study globalization under different flows which may be parallel, which may be simultaneous, yet may lack obvious connections. Okay. These disjunctive flows, as he calls them, are ethnoscapes, technoscapes, financescapes, mediascapes and idioscapes, all of which deserve individual attention as we study these, and also the connections and also the ruptures among all these different flows. Finally, I would like to end this by another quotation which says that globalization is not just an economic matter. You will recall that we had said that globalization is an area of study which may be looked at from so many different domains. For instance, globalization may be studied from the point of view of economics, definitely political science, sociology, anthropology, even language and literature. But from the cultural studies perspective, we may say that globalization is concerned with all these and more, okay, which includes cultural meaning, right. So, let me read again from here. While the values and meanings attached to place remain significant, we are increasingly involved in networks which extend far beyond our immediate physical locations. Okay. So, cultural meanings are now more loaded, okay. As we are able to forge connections through the electronic media, okay, their located or situated meanings are no longer the only meanings. There is a huge diversity and hybridity even of cultural meanings. Okay. So, this was a brief recap of what we did in the last lecture. Today, the topic of discussion is one that is immensely important in cultural studies. The topic is consumption, and we shall be discussing consumption over 2 lectures, okay, lectures 8 and 9 in this particular module. So, the study of consumption, again like globalization, is certainly not one that began with cultural studies. Cultural studies being, or at least contemporary cultural studies being a sort of a late entry, so to speak, in mainstream academics, particularly as compared to sociology or economics or literature. Consumption has been a topic of discussion, and there are important critics and important scholars, particularly in sociology, if I may say, okay, who have given very important insights into consumption. So, before we go or delve straight into the cultural studies exploration of consumption, let us look at how consumption has been studied so far. Okay. So, in studying consumption, we find that there may be different stages, okay, in the development of the discourses, and there are changes in the discourses, definite changes in the discourses on consumption. So, in the first stage, the focus, okay, the focus in the beginning stages of studying consumption was on topics like social deprivation, okay, or which classes or which social groups are deprived from consumption, deprived from consuming, who do not have enough consuming power. Okay. So, the study, as you will see here, was focused on deprivation, it was focused on poverty and its consequences for consumption, the buying power of people, or the lack of it in various social groups. Then there was also therefore study on the policies, okay, on state policies on consumption, deprivation, and say measures for poverty alleviation, right. So, the focus, as we see in this phase, was more on not having, the power to consume, not having the means to consume. We shall slowly see that this changes. However, in this phase we have scholars like Weber and Veblen, for instance, okay, who studied status groups, right, who, for instance, conspicuous consumption is a very important term in this phase by Veblen, and he studied the consumption, the obvious, very obvious, very conspicuous consumption patterns, right, of people. There was also focus on waste, okay, waste during the process of consumption. So, you see that all these two characteristics, one of waste and one of conspicuous consumption, is one that is not available to to groups of people who are economically challenged, who are deprived of consuming power. And also this phase, in this phase there was attention being drawn and theorizations being made on processes of social classification, affluence and the demonstration of prestige. So, these were the sociologists who belonged to the initial phases of the study of consumption. As you shall see, on the one hand the the discourse of deprivation and poverty, and on the other hand the discourse that focused on waste, that focused on you could say rampant consumption, and also on in a bid to demonstrate prestige, in a bid to demonstrate affluence and one's social class. So, these were the initial attempts at studying and theorizing consumption. In the next phase, we may talk about scholars like Bourdieu and Cassels, and we find, as it says here, a relative refinement. Okay? There is a relative refinement in sociological thinking on consumption, social position and lifestyle, right. There is, as if we may say, a certain sophistication in theory, and which says here of course a relative refinement compared to the earlier phase on thinking on consumption and affluence, on social position. There was also the beginning of empirical study and analysis of data of different classes on consumption. For instance, we find very important terms given by scholars like Bourdieu and others of taste, for instance. When they talk about, when scholars talk about a certain refinement in theorizing, we get terms like taste, distinction, etc. And what is taste? Taste is really a resource, okay. According to scholars, it is within the consumption discourse, taste is a resource with which people try to establish their location, okay, and also to enhance their location in the social order, right. So, taste does not become simply one's preferences, right. It is not simply one's preferences on an individual level. Taste is also to be exhibited, okay. Taste is to be exhibited, taste is to be cultivated, taste in various objects of consumption, okay, be it food, be it furniture, be it clothing, be it different markers, in different markers, symbols of social status, okay. So, taste therefore becomes a resource, a social resource, so to speak, whereby classes can establish and enhance their social standing within a given social order. We also have another term called distinction, right. Distinction is a term which which is to do with meanings, right, meanings that emanate from different classificatory schemes. These are the uses of hierarchical social relations, right. So, distinction like taste again is a theoretical tool which was developed in the second phase of the study on consumption by sociologists, right, which have to do with the classificatory schemes and hierarchies in social relations that allow you to distinguish also. Okay, it's not simply distinction in the sense of in the sense of having a certain distinction in one's social order. It is also distinctive, right, something that can distinguish one class from another. Hierarchy is an important term within this discourse of distinction. A third important word is in consumption studies is habitus, and habitus is both it's a structure of cognition, it's a structure of the cognitive apparatus in us, and it is a structure of cognition and of appropriate aspirations. So, let us read from here. Within habitus, the discourse of habitus, we study the relation between social and cultural structures and social agency. Habitus is also a structure of dispositions, they are schemas of classification, these are rules, expectations that predispose the individual to certain choices and actions, so that so it's like from the word habitat, okay, it is as if you occupy a certain habitus, right, which is both a structure of your cognitive apparatus as far as consumption, taste, distinction, these things are concerned, as well as it is sort of it is an agency, okay, towards appropriate aspirations belonging to your class. Hence, we have words here, important words here like structure, okay, schemas, rules and expectations which says predispose, okay, an individual to certain choices and actions. So, it is almost like a niche, if I may use the word, it is a niche that one has already, that one finds that is already available throughout through the different hierarchical systems and rules and schemas, okay, to people in a society. Habitus is acquired through family and community experiences of class structure, as also an individual's everyday experience of class, and it is also formed by long and collective transmitted experiences of the economic limitations of their class position. Okay. So, that the word habitus, the term habitus becomes a tool by which you can explore consumption patterns, consumption cognitions of consumption and practices of consumption of different social classes, right. And we also see how classes coalesce to sort of inhabit, okay, different habitus practices and different habitus forms, right. And this is something that is given by a long and established system, which is again delimited by the economic limitations of a particular class. So, we see that from studying poverty, social deprivation, okay, as far as consumption is concerned, the very classes that have consuming power slowly become the focus, okay, focus of consumption, right. Their everyday practices, their cultural practices, their tastes, their distinctions and habitus, okay, these. So, by now we have a body of knowledge or a body of discourses, right, surrounding the consumption practices and forms, the beliefs and schemas of human beings in society. Castles also focus on collective consumption, okay, on collective consumption, on the role of the state and on the role of capital, okay, the relation between state and capital and the processes of physical, material and social reproduction of consumption patterns. Okay. So, there was through Cassels and there was a focus on a focus that bound together politics, economics and the social. Fine. Now, we come to which really is our focus here on the cultural turn. After these developments in the discourse and after there was the development and establishment of different newer discourses focusing on newer terms like taste, distinction, etc., there was what we call the cultural turn in studies of consumption. Now, this cultural turn in studies of consumption is really a multidisciplinary approach. So, it is not one that is obviously based like all matters in cultural studies and all methodologies in cultural studies. Here too we find that it is a multidisciplinary approach spanning economics, anthropology, sociology and the like. Okay. Second, it is a post utilitarian methodology, that is it will not talk only about the uses of consumption, it will bring or it will broaden the area, so to speak, to speak about different experiences also, different experiences of consumption. For instance, the experience of shopping, for instance, what is entailed, the signifying practices in consuming objects, then a focus definitely on advertisements, etc. So, we find that there is a post utilitarian approach that comes into the study of consumption once we have the cultural turn. And then third, there is there is more focus or sometimes even exclusive focus on the semiotics of consumption, the semiotic systems, that is the sign systems. How do consumption objects, how are consumption objects, forms and practices represented? Okay. A, how does the state represent it? B, how do different corporations and business houses represent consumption objects, forms and practices, particularly through the media? What are the signs used and what are the politics of by now you are acquainted with signs signifying systems, etc. And here too we find quite a lot of focus really on the signifying practices of consumption. Okay. So, what do signs stand for? The politics of the sign. Next, number 4, the use and meanings of goods. Okay. So, in this post utilitarian schema we find that it is not that we do not talk about the use of goods, but also the utility of goods is strongly studied in reference to the meanings that are produced about goods. Okay. Any product, any commodity, and we will be talking about commodity on in another lecture, but a commodity is not simply something that has utility for us. Okay. There are other aspects of it, aesthetics for instance, how does a commodity look like, how is it presented. Okay. Then processes of representation that go into the commodity, processes, if you remember Althusser from our previous lectures, processes of interpellation or the commodity beckoning to you, the creation of desire even before we use the commodity, perhaps even sometimes before we can imagine the community, the creation of desire by processes and strategies of advertisements. These are things that create meaning around something that is actually only a commodity which should have use for us. So, more than really the use, and if at all the use of or the uses of commodities are studied, they are studied, as we have said, in relation to the meanings that adhere to them by the time the product is something that is to that we can we are ready to purchase. Okay. So, consumption therefore also includes the meanings that are attached to objects of consumption. Then there is also in the cultural turn relation to postmodernism, okay, in the sense that you study consumption, you studied consumption practices and forms according to the representations, as I said before, the representations, sometimes their surface meanings, okay, that come about in a in a system of discourses. Okay, so the object no longer remains, as we have seen so many times in cultural studies, the object no longer remains simply a material tangible object. Okay, the object is one which is full of surface meanings, full of discourses, full full of resonances from the past. Finally, there is definitely more importance given in the cultural turn in studies of consumption to experience. Okay, what is the experience? Not the utility, that is why we call it post utilitarian, not the utility or use value of goods of an object of consumption, but the onus is on the whole experience of consuming an consumption object, along with the experience of the meanings, the experience of all the signs and signifying practices, the experience also of the politics of the object of consumption. So, experience is more in focus than utility. In the same way, also aesthetics, as I said, how the product is presented or is represented to us, the use of color, the use of form, into which so much of study has gone into. So, the aesthetics, in studying the aesthetics of the object, is not that we are looking at it from a design perspective. Okay, we would be looking at it from the politics of aesthetic representation. Do you follow? Okay, not what is the aesthetics that has gone into it, or what are the dimensions of, not from certainly from a design point of view. If at all, it is what it is to do with the meanings of meanings that are attached to it through the process of aestheticization of the object, right. And finally, and not the least, the emotional aspects of consumption. What is it that what is the psychology behind consumption? Why are consumption patterns what they are? What goes into what is human desire? Okay, for as far as objects of consumption are concerned. Fine. So, you see again that there is definitely not just a broadening of the area, the broadening of the scope of consumption studies. Is almost, as we say, an explosion, okay, in this field with the cultural turn. Okay. So, to sum it up, what are the aspects of the cultural turn in studies of consumption? That it is post utilitarian, not to do only with the use value of an object. Okay. It is more to do with all the meanings that have been invested in these products, in these commodity, okay, right, and how they are represented, what are the politics of representation, of politics of aesthetics, and of experience, and what are the emotional investments. Okay. So, you can see how it is leading to a different route altogether in the study of consumption, which we do not really find, at least we do not find it to be the central concern in sociology. Okay. So, there is the difference here. Now, I would in this slide would like to quote from a scholar, Eva Illouz, in her essay, The Volatility of Stability, Emotion, Consumption and Imagination. This is what would form would point more towards cultural studies, even though this may be an essay from sociology, that this is in the study of emotion, consumption, of imagination. Okay. This is more in line with the cultural studies methodology. So, let us see what is given here, and this here she says, the seeming paradox of the stability of economic organization and of volatility of consumer desires can be accounted for. Now, A here is that there is on the one hand a stability of economic organization as far as the production of commodities, the production of goods is concerned, and on the other hand we see volatility. Okay, we see that it the pattern of consumer desires is not static, it is not it is not, and it perhaps cannot be well organized like the economic organization of consuming, okay, of producing and distributing consumer goods. So, there is a paradox A, which is which is the stability of economic organization and the volatility or ever changing patterns of consumer desires. Now, how do we account for this? Now, this would be a question in posed by a cultural studies scholar. So, this can be, as she says, this can be accounted for by examining the emotional dynamic of consumption. So, she says here that it is you cannot get to an understanding or you cannot get to an explanation or accounting for such volatility and stability at the same time, okay, by looking at for instance say economics. Okay. So, she says that you will then have to look at the emotional contours of the consumption process. This can be accounted for by what she calls the emotional dynamic of consumption. Further, she says emotions are an essential, though or albeit unacknowledged ingredient of the dynamic of consumption. So, there are scholars therefore who have recently brought home to us the need to look at also the things like emotional aspects of consumption, which was perhaps not at least the central focus in earlier studies. So, emotions are an essential albeit unacknowledged ingredient of the dynamic of consumption and constitute the self-sustaining mechanism of the perpetually moving sands, and she puts it beautifully here, the perpetually moving sands of consumption. So, once this is admitted, once this becomes the focus, interestingly it also is something that is all too quickly harnessed by the producers, by advertising concerns, okay, to sort of harness or to grab the emotions of or to capitalize on the emotions of the consumer. Therefore, apart from consumption involving emotion, right, consumption involves meaning from a cultural studies perspective. Consumption involves meaning, and these meanings, like all cultural meanings, are meanings that are shared. Okay? Cultural meanings are necessarily shared meanings. Individual preferences are formed within cultures, and we draw on languages, values, rituals and habits. This is in no way less applicable to the processes of consumption in a cultural study of consumption. Okay? And through culturally specific forms of consumption, we produce and reproduce cultures and complicate social relations and indeed society. This also is the explanatory framework in cultural studies for the discourse, cultural studies discourse on consumption. So, finally, if all consumption is culturally meaningful, then phenomena, for instance like eating out, cannot be seen as being simply functional or as a matter of plain convenience. Now, this is a topic of eating out, which would be our focus in the next as a cultural practice, as a consumption practice in our next lecture on consumption. But the point being made here is any consumption practice, an act of buying, an act of deciding to buy an object, to consume an object, an act of preparing and planning to buy an appliance, for instance. Okay, these are again not simple activities that we do. They are not just functional activities, they are not activities that we use for our utility, to something that will enhance our utility. That is the point being made by cultural studies. Okay? It is not simply a matter of convenience, a matter of making life more easy, so to speak, in buying an appliance. All the peripheral things are also most important here, right? The emotion that goes into building the desire, okay, for an appliance, the meanings that are attached to a particular appliance, right, or a particular practice like eating out, for instance. Okay, these are things that hitherto have not been pointed or at least things that have not been the central focus in consumption. So, cultural studies therefore looks at consumption, to sum it up, looks at consumption not as an act whereby we approach an object only by considering its use value, its functionality, or for the convenience is going to bring to us. There is so much more than this, particularly from cultural meanings, collective cultural meanings, collective cultural decisions, okay, that go into the process of consuming or consuming objects. Now, we shall go on to consider another scholar, Baudrillard, on consumption, and quickly we shall see, you know, what he has to articulate, okay, regarding consumption. Interestingly, he says, we consume, therefore we are. Obviously, this is you know, this is a play on, you will recognize this as a play on Rene Descartes' famous statement, I think, therefore I am. What Baudrillard says here is important because he is you know, showing to us the centrality of consumption in our lives. Okay? We consume, therefore we are. The point here is our, you know, consumption affects, at least, you know, it affects what we think about our and others' status. Consumption is to do with prestige, okay? Consumption is to do with power, right? So, it is as if, you know, we exist in order to consume. We consume, therefore we are, right? We exist because we consume, or even we exist in order to consume. Such is the importance of consumption in our lives, right? So, we consume, therefore we are, and it is a relation between signs that enables difference to be established. Now, Baudrillard again is following the structuralist, post-structuralist methodology here, and again is harping on signs. The relation between signs and the difference, right, difference that you know, objects signify. It is the difference between these signifying practices among objects that lies at the core, or is at the core of consumption. How? He says it is difference from others, right? It is difference from others that is one of the main uses of consumption. Okay, this is really one, I would say, one of it's a very strong way to put it. For instance, we did say a while ago that consumption is not about utility, simply utility, that it is not simply about functionality or convenience, but here Baudrillard even says, he says we consume, therefore we are, and he says that one of the main even uses of consumption, you would have thought that the use of consumption is, you know, to consume an object, to possess an object, which would give us some sort of a psychological, material sort of satisfaction. Okay? He says no, the uses of consumption are not to do only with the gratification, okay, the gratification of our needs. The uses of consumption is also that what we consume is a sign of our difference from others. It is our choice in selecting object A and not object B, okay, is not because object A is more useful to us, or that object A would be more functional or convenient for us. It is also because object A differentiates me from another person, right. So, therefore, the object of consumption becomes a sign, and our practices of consumption, okay, become signifying practices, signs of difference, of differentiation of one person with the others or with another, right. This is very important. People seek to establish that they have more tastes than others, and there is, most importantly, creating a sense of identity. And in, again, you know, this you will recall that identity is a central concern of whether we are talking about ethnicity, race and nation, whether we are talking about our social identity, whether we are talking about prestige. Okay. Identity is a central concern in cultural studies, and in cultural studies, consumption, consuming patterns, consuming choices, okay, these are also seen as strategies, means by which we create a sense of identity. So, the purchasing and consuming of an object is not, therefore, not just not a simple sort of innocent practice of buying what we want. Okay. It is differentiating. It is a differentiating strategy. It is an identity creating strategy for us. That is why, you know, we have called the cultural turn a post utilitarian turn as far as consumption is concerned. And of course, therefore, it is the symbolic which is very important, the symbolic which is a part of late capitalism, is part and parcel, or is a feature of you know, postmodernism, right. So, finally, he says we are fated to continue to desire the consumer experiences, right. It is not that it has to be so, but as long as we are within the, you know, the interpolating, as long as we are within the interpolating so to speak, interpolating realities, right, of the consumer experience. As long as we are there, in that sense we are fated to continue to desire the consumer experiences. Therefore, the consumer experience, again to sum up, the consumer experience is not an experience that is only a material one. Okay. Cultural studies would say that what lingers on even after something is materially consumed is the feeling of having created an identity for oneself, the feeling of having established or enhanced, right, one's status through what? Through a system of differentiation using that object, okay, using that object as standing for or using it as a symbol or a sign of one's status or hierarchy or place in hierarchy. Okay. So, in that sense, Baudrillard says we are fated to desire the consumer experiences, because again, because it means so much more than simply consuming something materially and gratifying ourselves materially, at least ourselves at least in a material sort of way. Okay. There are in addition the meanings which are so important for us. So, I hope you have you have an idea by now, a fair enough idea by now of how we are moving from earlier ways of looking at consumption, particularly in sociology, to a cultural turn that deals with meanings, signifying practices, systems of differentiation and representation. Therefore, this also leads to another critic in the structuralist, post-structuralist school, Roland Barthes. You have come across some of Barthes' formulations in previous lectures. Roland Barthes too, following this way of thinking, declares that the function of an object, okay, is not simply, the fulfilling of one's desires. The function of objects are part and parcel of semiotic systems. Okay. It is again, what is interesting here is even functionality is by Barthes, Roland Barthes, it is also related, he says it is also related to the systems of science, or what he calls the semiotic practices, right. So, even functions are objects are there to function as part of semiotic practices, right. So, the central problem in looking at the meaning of things in consumer culture is how to completely avoid naturalizing needs and things and maintain the position that all consumption is cultural. Obviously, it is, we have to avoid a naturalistic sort of framework in our understanding, okay, because meanings of things do not lie, so to speak, in the material object itself, in the sense that meanings are attached, okay, meanings are attached. They do not, objects do not come to us ever in pristine forms that have no meanings attached to them, okay. So one of the problems, if you want to culturalize consumption, that is, if you want to study consumption from a cultural studies perspective, is this, that you have to show that things cannot be naturalized. Well, we will stop here as far as the articulation of the cultural studies orientation to consumption is concerned. There will be more about consumption in the next lecture, when we will be talking about consumption by referring to one form of consumption practice, the cultural practice of eating out, where we should see how to theorize eating out from a cultural studies perspective on consumption, where we shall see these as not simply functional or even matters of convenience, and we shall see what goes into building a discourse, right. So, in the first part of the discussion on consumption, I tried to show you how the discourse of consumption has changed, and how it is, like as with all studies, cultural studies methodologies, how this is also, consumption also is concerned with processes of representation, with processes of culturalization, of identity formation, okay, of a way of looking at objects from a completely non or post utilitarian perspective, which even led, as we saw a while ago, Baudrillard to declare that we consume, therefore we are. Okay. There is of course a lot to be said, and some of the things which I had left here would be taken up in when we discuss in the next module, when we discuss forms of culture, forms in cultural studies, which when we will be talking about the commodity, that is where I begin talking about the commodity first, as given to as the commodity, explanation of the commodity, description of the commodity given to us by a scholar like Karl Marx, for instance. Okay. So, I hope for now it suffices for us to simply draw out how cultural studies approach to consumption is different from a sociological or economics based approach to consumption. So, let us look at a few questions here. Now, if you get a question like this, what are the phases in the study of consumption? We know from our discussion that there are phases of studies of studying consumption before the cultural turn, and in the earlier phases we saw, which are characterized by scholars like Weber and Veblen, for instance. Okay, we saw that there was a focus on poverty, focus on the social deprivation as far as consumption is concerned, how people do not have access to consumption. There was also, on the other hand, apart from the discourse on poverty and consumption, there was a discourse on excess, right, discourse of excess in consumption, where we have scholars like Veblen talking about conspicuous consumption by some classes, and on waste, the discourse of waste, and how these led to social classification, the issues of issues of affluence, of prestige, of terms like for instance in the following phase, terms given to us by Bordeaux and others of taste, terms like taste, terms like distinction, and the a growing sophistication in the discourse, or way, or as a scholar put it, a refinement in talking about about consumption in sociological terms, okay, thinking of it in terms of social position and lifestyle, okay, and hierarchies in our social order, and also there is an empirical turn in this phase in studying consumption practices. Then we find that finally we have the cultural turn, which as we have discussed at great length, I hope, of post that which talks about, which gives more importance on signs, on signifying practices, see as production through, at least we have seen in some cases, for instance Roland Barthes, when he talks about the function of objects as semiotic systems, right. So semiotics, study of signs, about the meanings that adhere or are attached to consumer goods, the aesthetics of representation, the experience of consumption, and the emotional aspects of consumption, right. We also saw that how the paradox, according to one scholar, the paradox of stability in economic organization and volatility in consumption is to be addressed by bringing in the aspect of emotions as far as the consumer is concerned. Okay. So, this is a cultural turn which is multidisciplinary and post-utilitarian. Then if you get a question, define habitus, we will then say that habitus is both a structure of cognition in our minds as well as agency of appropriate aspirations. You may highlight the fact that habitus is to be seen as structures of classification, of schemas, of rules, and this emanate from one's habitat, emanates from the family and community experiences of one's class, one's class standing, and not simply one's individual experiences of class. These both together give us a sense of habitus, and these are the experiences transmitted through a long tradition or a long and collective transmission of experiences by classes that whose aspirations are delimited by economic considerations. So, well, we shall stop here now as far as this part of the lecture on consumption is concerned, and as I had said in the following lecture, in the 9th lecture in this module, we shall be looking at the cultural practice of eating out from the point of cultural studies of consumption. Thank you for now.